The next speaker is Piet Verdonschot from Wageningen University. We are going to shift now a little bit from lakes, standing waters mostly, to streams. And Piet will talk about the effects of climate change on streams and restoration issues, I would think. Go on.
Okay, thank you, Jos, for this introduction. Good afternoon. I hope you keep up with me the next half hour. It's longer than the foregoing sessions, and I have a lot of slides to show you, so if you can't follow up, just fall asleep. I don't care. Luc just made a nice statement. Climate change is much more than temperature, and I would like to support that, because I'm going to talk about precipitation part of climate change, and especially the precipitation in relation to hydrology and biology. But before that, I want to thank my co-author Anna Besser for her contribution in this talk. So we heard today a lot about climate, temperature, nutrients relationships, which is also present in lowland streams, because I'm going to talk mainly about lowland streams. But, my focus will be today between the climate, precipitation and hydrology, because for streams, but I think also for lakes, hydrology is an often forgotten parameter, and I think ecologists for a long time forgot to look at hydrology and left hydrology to the hydrologists, which we should not do, because I hope to show you in the next 30 minutes that this is the most crucial factor in these ecosystems. Okay, something we already saw a few times today is what's happening in the next 50 years. And if you look at the Netherlands and the Royal Meteorological Institute, then you see that the average winter precipitation will increase with 14%. The average summer precipitation will decrease by almost 20%. Precipitation on the wettest summer day will increase. That's an important part, because that will give a lot of change in summer. And evaporation, which most people forget, but will rise with 15%, so which makes dry summers much drier. So if you look at a hydrograph of a common lowland stream, at least before, somewhere in the past, people started changing streams. Most of my colleagues in Europe and the rest of the world think that I'm all working in ditches, because our streams mostly look like that. But originally they had a hydrograph which was somewhat higher in wintertime and somewhat lower in summertime, but quite constant throughout the overall year. If you look at the hydrograph for the future, then there will be a higher winter discharge, because the precipitation in winter is higher. There will be a lower summer discharge because of drought, and there will be a lot of dynamics in much more dynamics in wintertime as well as in summertime. The peaks in summer will be higher, and the dynamics in winter will be higher. So what we are facing is more extremes, a higher rate of change in discharge, and a more dynamic system. And then the next question is, and the most important question is, how do our ecosystems cope with this increasing dynamics? To look into that, I just drafted this very simple and a very known diagram. We have climate affecting hydrology, hydrology affecting morphology, and that decides on which biology we'll get. One important parameter here is land use, because land use is one of the most driving factors up to now into these ecosystems. Within the talk, I will show you a few examples to sort out how this diagram is built up and what evidence we already have, how these relationships are, by looking into precipitation, discharge, current, agricultural activity, riparian zones, profile and substrates, and all ending up with the macroinvertebrates, because that's my major hobby. Okay, the first question in this whole diagram is, does climate affect land use and hydrology? And of course within a certain geographical region. So what kind of effects climate has on land use as well as on hydrology? But before doing that, I start with temperature because there's something very interesting in temperature, and you have seen this. I have to get used to this thing. We have seen a lot of these kind of pictures that in this case, over the last 55 years, we see an increase in temperature, and you can do a regression analysis on that, and then it is even not really significant, but okay, there's an increase. But if you really analyze these data, then you find out some very interesting thing, is that in these 55 years, up to 1987, or just around that period, temperature did not change so much. And if you look after that year, also temperature did not change that much. There's a lot of fluctuations, a lot of dynamics, but there's not so much change. Most of the change occurred in one moment. It's about 1 degree Celsius increase. That's because that's the moment in time in northwestern Europe that the North Atlantic oscillation changed. So the whole pattern of clouds over North America and Europe, this is a very short explanation, changed in that way that the whole temperature went up. And this is not the only example, because these are the Dutch data, but if you look at other European countries and other data, then there are at least up to now 25 examples of temperature ranges which show exactly the same pattern with this very important change. This North Atlantic oscillation is also the driver of precipitation. If you look then in both precipitation, temperature, the upper curve, and precipitation, then we see that in the last 20 years, so since the end of the 80s, temperatures went up, it became warmer, but also precipitation went up, it became wetter. It should happen there, yeah. Okay, keeping that in mind, then we are going to look what was happening in the past. And if you look here is an example from data from the Vecht catchment in the eastern part of the Netherlands. What we did is looking into the land use in 4 periods, in 1900, 1930, 1916 and 2000. And you see that grassland, fields and urbanization increased, which is not surprisingly because the population is growing and all the rest is following. It's nicely fitting in Brian's socio-economic pattern this morning. We also see, of course, that natural areas are decreasing, which are not really natural areas, of course, because the Dutch already started in the Middle Ages to change the environment, and now we call this nature, but it's just one extensive form of agriculture. But that decreased quite strongly. This is an important picture because if you look, keep this in mind. First this. The second thing what was happening is that discharge is changing. And this is a prediction we made on data for a southern catchment in the Netherlands. These are 4 climate scenarios. These first, the blue, the light, the white and the blue one, are the current climate scenarios. And if you calculate for the average lowland stream in the Netherlands what the pattern in the future will be, then that confirms the pattern I already showed you. The base flow will go down there. And the extremes, so the high flow classes up to very extreme flows, will go up in the next 100 years. So if we conclude on these 2 features, then we saw that climate is going up, it's becoming warmer, especially in the last 20 years. Climate drives hydrology, which came out of this prediction pattern I showed you. Land use changed a lot in the last 100 years. And most of the land use changes were in the first 30 years of the 1900s. And what's clear at the pattern, in any of these analysis we could show any climate effect, because land use is so dominant that climate doesn't add much to change up to now. So, in conclusion, climate doesn't really drive land use, but climate really drives hydrology. Brings me to the second question this afternoon. The question is, what's the influence of land use on our hydromorphology and our lowland streams? So what's happening in this area here? First, I go to my colleagues in Toulouse. They did a nice calculation where they joined land use cover of different land uses all over Europe at least data sets on different sites in Europe. And they combined these land cover classes with hydromorphological data from the streams in these examples, these 140 sites or catchments. And they came up with this very nice graph that there was a very strong correlation between the land use, land cover parameters and the width and the depth of the streams. So there are strong interactions were shown between catchment use and river morphology, which is not surprisingly either, because also in the Netherlands we changed our areas to, from forested areas to agricultural areas, and we cut down all our riparian zones along the streams, which is about the same thing what happens all over Europe. If you look in the Netherlands itself and in the data we collected from the same Vechtman catchment, then you can see that most of the meandering streams in the Netherlands were still present around the 1900s. And in the 1930s already the meandering pattern, the sinuosity, which is a parameter for meandering, went down. And after that, in the 60s, there was a last phase of channelization, and in the end we channelized most of our streams, except for one of the areas, which is the Dinkel area, because that's a quite natural area, so the streams are still more or less meandering there. So land use is the major driver of morphology of streams in this example. So if you look at land use and morphology, then land use cover directly influences hydromorphology, and morphology strongly influences the changes in the hydrology of the streams and not so much the climate. So these two relationships are very important there. My third question is, does climate, in this case precipitation, directly affect biology? What we saw with temperature, that the temperature directly often has a direct influence on the biology, but the question is if precipitation also is a direct factor. And therefore we use this example from the Ruwenberger Beek, which is a stream in the eastern part of the Netherlands. We calculated the water quality index, not with the Dutch way to calculate it, but with the Asterix program, which is a European-based assessment program for macroinvertebrates in lowland streams. And you see that the stream scores, each half year samples were taken, and that the score varies between 2 and 5, which is very often in quality scores. But there's a nice pattern of scores over the last 25 years in this stream, which would be suggesting that the variation is very big and the quality measure is not so very suited, or maybe the Asterix program doesn't calculate the quality so well. But if you then project precipitation on this curve, the half-year precipitation before this quality score was calculated, so before the half-year of precipitation the macroinvertebrate community could respond to, then you see quite a fit between the white and the yellow dots. The whites is the precipitation, the yellows is the quality index. And if you do a regression analysis on it and you test this relationship, then there's a very neat relationship between precipitation pattern in the half year before the quality score was calculated and the quality. So your quality score can vary throughout the years based on the weather pattern in the foregoing half year. So this implies that climate directly, through precipitation, affects your biology. My fourth question is, what are the effects of changes in hydromorphology? So I just take the center here, all these combinations of parameters, and how do hydrology and morphology affect our biology? The first example I take from a small study, it was quite a study from streams she did in the Netherlands. We looked into a natural stream and a semi-natural stream, and at the population of Agapetus fuchsipes, which is a trichopteran living in lowland streams, especially in natural lowland streams. And we sampled 2 stretches in each of the streams of 5 meter length. We did that for more than 1 year. We measured continuously the discharge of these streams. We did substrate surveys, and we took samples of Agapetus fuchsipes. You can see its case here, the animal is inside. and we followed the whole population throughout time. If you look at the discharge, the hydrograph of these two streams, the white line is the natural stream, the yellow line is the semi-natural stream. If you look at the discharge pattern, then you can see, first of all, of course, there are a number of peaks in the system, especially in the semi-natural system. You have quite a lot of peak flows, spades in time. And in the natural system, we have one spade here, which becomes very important. The next slide, if we go looking at these three spades, keep them in mind for the next slide. So the first in the natural stream and the two next ones in the semi-natural stream. Then we look into the population dynamics of the Trichopteran. These are the larvae, the white line of the larvae of Agapetus in the natural stream. The dotted white line are the pupae in the natural stream. The yellow line are the larvae in the semi-natural stream. And the dotted yellow line are the pupae in the semi-natural stream. And what we see is that the larvae in the natural stream more or less go down. The number goes down because they pupate, and the pupae you can see here. But what you would expect is after the pupae fly out, they deposit their eggs and a new generation would be born. So that you would expect a new rise in larvae here again in the natural stream, which does not occur. And secondly, you see the larvae in the semi-natural stream. They pupate in the yellow line here. The pupae emerge, they deposit eggs, and there are new larvae in the semi-natural stream here. But what happens? We saw three major spades in these systems. The first in the natural stream washed out all the young larvae or the eggs after this pupae phase of this population. So in the natural stream, because of the one peak in discharge, erased most of the population there. In the semi-natural stream, the pupae were somewhat earlier in time because the temperature is somewhat higher in this stream. The young larvae were born here. Now I don't have any light anymore. The young larvae were here. But then the spade in the semi-natural stream erased most of the young larvae. And the third spade, you can see, it doesn't affect the whole system because then the populations were already very small. Okay, that's one example on the direct effect of discharge on the biology. Second example I'll take from our artificial streams. In Altera we have these nice artificial streams. And we did an experiment with 3 Trichopterans. I won't name them. The white and the yellow and the green one. And we did a number of disturbance experiments. What we did, the disturbance, the first disturbance we did was increasing the current velocity in these streams. The increase of a current velocity means an increase in disturbance for this system. And if you look at the 3 species, you can see the white one very fastly, because what's scored here is the moment an individual leaves its position. So what we did was looking into the stream, just observing what was happening and timing what was really happening. And each dot is one specimen. So the white species very quickly moved out when the current velocity went up. If you look at the green species, there was some delay in response, not from all individuals, but a number of individuals responded more slowly. And the yellow one was even more slower in its response. But that was not the only disturbance we brought into these streams. We also did disturbances by sand cover, because when there's a high peak discharge in a lowland stream, a lot of sand is just transported, is moved over the bottom or transported through the water column. So you get a thick or a thin sand cover, new sand cover on the stream bottom. Or organic material what's present on the bottom of these streams is starting moving because the current velocity goes up and discharge goes up. So these kind of disturbances we did in these kind of experiments I showed you with current velocity. And what we saw is in the first, animals started drifting. They leave their habitat. That took them 21 minutes on average. When there was a thick sand cover, Either the animals escape the sand, just climb out of their cases, go up, build a new case and move out, or died. Most of them died. If there are thin sand covers, most of the animals drift, but very quick, very fast, in 7 minutes. And if you stir the substrate, then even within 2 minutes the animals leave the substrate. So that implies that each change in discharge, which is at least related to movement of grains, so the discharge is high enough that there's a lot of movement in the stream, triggers response of these animals. So there's a species-specific response. Each of these trichopterans, which are all very rare in Dutch streams and are very typical lowland stream species, have a specific response to disturbance. And not only for the current, also they showed different responses to different kind of disturbances. If there is a fast increase in flow, which always occurs after heavy rainfall, so during heavy rainfall, discharge goes very quickly up, that occurs within a few hours, then specimens start moving into the system. They drift, and after drifting we observe that they seek shelter. I won't go into that today. If you go deeper into these species, then we have here the white one and the green one and the yellow one. If you look into the causal explanation, why do these specimens respond to increase in current velocity and thus to increase in discharge, then that's related to their cases. The first two have an organic case, and the last one has a mineral case, so it's much more heavier than the first two. In current velocity increase, this responded much slower. They are different in size. The small ones responded very much more quickly than the large ones, and there's a difference in their legs. Their muscles in their legs is quite different. These, with mineral cases, have very short and wide legs, which are very strong and can hold very long time before they move. So if current would go up very high, they still can fix themselves to the substrate. While the very small, light ones with intermediate legs have an intermediate power, and the long, slender ones are very vulnerable. They will move very quickly out. So there's a trade-off between habitat binding, how these species live in a certain habitat, and the risk of drifting, so how they are moved out of their position. Another example of these relationships between hydrology and substrates you take from my Austrian colleagues. They looked into a reference streams in Austria and a disturbance site. The reference and the disturbance is related to the land use. And in the reference site there's a very heterogeneous substrate, and in the disturbed site there's a very homogeneous substrate. And if you, what they found out is that in the disturbance, so there's a certain type of agricultural land use that was the cause of a lot of siltation in this disturbed stream. While still most habitats are present in the disturbed stream, they were more or less become rare and only present in the bank side of the stream. While in the not silted stream there was a large heterogeneity of habitats. And if they looked into another trichopteran, and they looked into how the trichopteran life stages live in different substrates, you can see that in the reference sites a number of these life stages, larval stage 1 up to 5, and the pupae are distributed over quite a number of different types of substrates, which they can find in these heterogeneous, very natural streams. But if you look into the disturbed site, then there's only one habitat they can occupy, and all stages are in this one habitat. Only the pupae are not present there, so this species cannot finish its life cycle in this disturbed stream. So the life stages of these trichopterans have their own habitat preferences. So habitat preferences not only linked to a species, but also to a stage or a life stage of a species. And species cannot always complete their life cycle at a certain site, not because they cannot occur at the site, but because some of their life stages do not find the suited habitat there. And a reference site often offers, of course, a lot of refuges for these species. I skip a few to go to the answers of this question. First, what I've tried to show you is that discharge extremes are very important for survival of species. If there are spates at a certain wrong moment in time, as we saw with the agapetus example, then species will disappear from the stream. If the spates occur at another moment in time, they maybe do not affect species. So there's a very delicate balance between how discharge patterns are and whether or not species can survive there. Furthermore, species respond individually to all kinds of these disturbances, and I've shown that with the trichopteran example, that it's not so simple that if you have a disturbance then the community changes. No, if you have a disturbance then certain species change, and any disturbance to any spot in time, spot in space or moment in time will affect which species will survive or will not survive. And the riparian zone is very important, but I skipped that example for the streams. And hydrology, substrates and biology are very strongly linked. So these links are very important for the stream invertebrates. I'll skip this one too to go to the final picture of what I try to support today. Is I started with the relationship between climate, hydrology, land use, morphology and biology. And if you look at climate change, then I also added, for the example, the temperature in, because there's a direct effect to species diversity. In precipitation, we see that it's not only going up, it's also going down. So there's more dynamics in precipitation, which leads to an increase in discharge dynamics, which also leads to an increase in current dynamics. So there's more dynamics in the whole hydrological part of the stream system. And at the same time, land use will affect the whole system, but riparian zones disappear because of the land use. Profiles of streams changed towards a more homogeneous profile. Substrate variability went down because we get much more homogeneous substrates. And in the end, all these dynamics and changes, this is mainly man-induced, this is mainly climate-induced, lead to a species diversity loss. So if we want to tackle this problem, then we must tackle the kind of climate adaptation in the middle part of this scheme, and I'll tell you why we should focus on this part and not on current or substrate, but the larger scale. If we look at a stream system, we have an axis in time going from days to decennia. We also have an axis in space going from habitats up to the ecoregions. So there's a hierarchy both in time and space. If you look at the species, then each region in Europe or whatever on the world has a regional species pool. So that's the major pool we can have species of into our systems. But if we go down into the system itself, then there's a selection mechanism of which species will survive or which will not survive. Climate change affects this whole system major at the top level because it affects precipitation and temperature. So it comes in at this height. So if you look at the same picture and we look at the current situation, then, for example, you can have spates in a certain lowland stream. You can have a certain temperature maximum for species, which we saw a number of examples this morning already. If we project the species in, then maybe a species can survive, or a species groups, and it can survive these two extremes. They can survive the spates of this moment, the current spates, and they can survive the current temperature patterns. Another species can also survive maybe this spate. As soon as they can't survive the spate, like the agapetus example, where the spates were at the wrong moment in time, or when the disturbance is too high, then these species or species groups become vulnerable. So vulnerability is an axis in vertical direction, which is the same direction as the stress. Climate change now implies that our spates will go up and our temperature will go up. So that means that not only species group 2 will disappear because of our human-induced disturbances, but also our species group 1 is disappearing because of climate change, and because of these increasing spates and these increasing temperatures. And at the same time, we already heard some examples on that, invasive species will come in. So climate change introduces more dynamics, more extremes, more instability, loss of biodiversity, and the income of a number of invasives. If you look at the same picture, we would tackle our landscape at a more wider scale, at the landscape scale. So that's why I said we should not restore streams at the local scale or at the stretch scale. But if we would tackle it at the landscape scale or catchment scale, and at the same time increase our habitat heterogeneity, that would imply that our extremes from climate would be brought back to that level, which would mean that we would support better circumstances for species group 1, which could develop more streams, and also species group 2 would survive again. At the same time, these species would occupy the space which cannot be occupied by the invasive species, and that would mean that ends up in a higher biodiversity. So the main take-home message would be, in this case, that hydromorphology is very crucial in lowland streams. Hydromorphology is a key factor in adaptation strategies for climate change. And if we do these adaptation strategy, hydromorphology measures should be taken at the catchment scale to increase habitat heterogeneity and connectivity between habitats. So that means that an increase of biodiversity. It implies that we get hydrological buffers in the system, so we get also the safety aspect in it. And it would also imply that we reduce the nutrients in the system, so we improve our water quality. And that's where I want to thank you for your attention, and for those who are interested in my last theory on which measures do we have to take, there's a card somewhere in this building, this card, and if you want to receive a book which is on which measures water managers have to take to tackle this climate change, this book will be released next week, and if you have this card you can ask for one. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Piet. You convinced us that increases in precipitation will have a major impact on our streams, and maybe we can repair some of the damage, and that I hope so. At the same time, maybe keeping the water longer in the landscape will also be an important goal to achieve. I think we have no time for questions, unfortunately. We have to move on now, and I think we can just now start our tea break annex excursion to the ocean. And I really wish you a lot of inspiration there and a lot of interesting views. I would like to ask you to be